Number 10. The Ica Stones. In 1966, Peruvian physician Javier Cabrera d'Arquea received an engraved stone from a farmer near Ica. It appeared to show an extinct fish. Within decades, his collection had grown to more than 15,000 stones, with carvings of surgery, astronomy, and humans standing beside dinosaurs. That was the problem. Dinosaurs are believed to have vanished around 65 million years before human beings existed. If the stones were ancient, the timeline was impossible. If the timeline was right, the stones had to be modern. The stones ranged from small handheld pieces to heavy objects weighing hundreds of pounds. Many were carved into andesite, a hard volcanic rock that can develop a dark oxidation patina over long periods of time. Supporters argued that in some examples, the carved grooves seemed to weather like the surrounding surface. If true, that would be difficult to explain as recent work. The most disturbing images were the dinosaur scenes, because they turned a local curiosity into a confrontation with the official timeline. But the case appeared to collapse in 1975, when a local farmer named Basilio Ushuaia confessed that he had carved some of the stones himself. For mainstream archaeology, that confession gave the story a clean ending. The Ica Stones were not a forbidden archive from a lost civilization. They were modern fabrications, tourist objects, or part of a local trade built around collectors who wanted the impossible to be real. And some of them almost certainly were modern. A serious version of this story has to admit that. Once a mystery becomes famous, copies appear. Once collectors start paying, uncertainty becomes an economy. Fraud does not simply damage a case like this. It contaminates everything around it. But the confession explained some stones. It did not explain the entire archive, Ushuaia later recanted, claiming he had admitted to carving the stones because he feared punishment for selling pre-Columbian artifacts. That reversal did not prove the stones were ancient, but it reopened the larger problem. If every stone was fake, who produced them all? Where was the workshop? Where were the tools, the production chain, and the system needed to create thousands of carvings across years or decades? A few fake stones are easy to explain. A contaminated collection is easy to dismiss. But a massive archive with obvious forgeries, disputed specimens, uneven quality, and no complete catalog is harder to close. The deeper problem is not that the Ica Stones prove humans saw dinosaurs. They do not. The evidence is not strong enough for that claim. The deeper problem is that the collection has never been resolved in a way that satisfies the questions around it. No full public catalog separated the obvious modern carvings from the specimens that still deserved testing. No final study ended the debate. No trusted institution gave the whole archive the kind of examination that could make the mystery disappear. So the stones remain in historical limbo, too famous to vanish, too disputed to be accepted, too contaminated to become evidence, but too large to be forgotten. In Cabrera's museum in Ica, visitors still walk past the carvings. They see humans, animals, stars, tools, and creatures that do not belong in the same frame. Maybe the original mystery was buried under later fraud before anyone could properly examine it. Either way, the Ica Stones expose something uncomfortable about archaeology. Sometimes the question is not whether an object is real or fake. Sometimes the question is whether anyone still has the patience to separate the two. If the Ica Stones are too loud to trust, the next object is small, quiet, and buried in the wrong layer of earth. Number 9. The Nampa Figurine. On August 11th, 1889, a drilling crew was working near Nampa, Idaho, pulling material from deep below the surface. They were not excavating a ruin, searching for lost art, or trying to challenge the story of human evolution. They were drilling through mapped geological layers when something small reportedly came up from a depth of about 300 feet. It was a clay figurine, roughly 1.5 inches tall, shaped like a human body. It had a head, a torso, arms, legs, and the suggestion of a face. By itself, it was not impressive. It was tiny, simple, and easy to overlook. The problem was not what it looked like. The problem was where it came from. The strata at that depth were associated with the Pleo-Pleistocene boundary, roughly 2 million years old. According to the accepted timeline, no human population capable of shaping symbolic clay figures should have been living in North America at that time. Homo habilis was only emerging in Africa, and the human presence in the Americas belonged to a much later chapter. The object was strange. The layer was worse. If the figurine truly came from that layer, it would not be a small correction to history. It would be a direct challenge to the timeline of human migration, symbolic behavior, and early art. It would suggest that someone, or something close enough to human to shape a human-like body, existed in a place and time where such a maker should not have been. The object was reportedly turned over to Charles F. Adams, a mining official supervising the operation. The depth and circumstances of the find were documented, and the figurine was later examined by scholars, including Professor Albert A. Wright of Oberlin College and geologist G.F. Wright, who published on the object in 1890. Early accounts claimed that the surrounding clay matrix was undisturbed and that the figurine showed no clear sign of having been recently introduced into the sample. Mainstream explanations moved in safer directions. Perhaps the object fell into the drill material from above. Perhaps the drilling process mixed layers. Perhaps the early observers misunderstood what they were seeing. Perhaps the figurine was a hoax, inserted during a period when strange archaeological claims were easier to circulate than to verify. Those doubts are reasonable. A 2-million-year-old clay figurine from Idaho would require extraordinary evidence, and the surviving documentation is not strong enough to rewrite human history. No serious account should pretend otherwise. But the ordinary explanations leave behind their own problem. The drilling system used in 1889 was not an obvious way for a delicate object to travel intact into deep material and appear naturally inside a core sample. Early observers described the clay around it as undisturbed. The figurine was said to carry iron staining consistent with prolonged burial, and its composition was reported to match the clay from the drill core. None of this proves the impossible, but it explains why the object refuses to disappear. Unlike the Ica Stones, the Nampa Figurine does not look designed to shock anyone. It is just a small, human-shaped object, pulled from a depth where no human-shaped idea was supposed to exist. That is what makes it difficult to forget. If it is fake, then it is a strange 19th century curiosity. If it is real, then it becomes one of the most uncomfortable objects ever reported from North American soil. Not because it is large, beautiful, or complex, but because it suggests a hand making a body in clay almost 2 million years before history allows that hand to be there. The object is rarely discussed outside the margins of forbidden archaeology. It survives mostly as a disputed report, buried under layers of doubt. The Nampa Figurine does not prove a lost civilization. It does not prove humans lived in Idaho 2 million years ago. But it preserves a question that has never been fully erased. How did a human-shaped object end up in a layer of earth that should not have contained one? A drill went down into ancient clay. A tiny figure came back up. And for more than 130 years, the timeline has had to step around it. One tiny figure can disturb a timeline. But the next discovery disturbed something larger, the order of civilization itself. Number 8. Göbekli Tepe. In 1994, German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt recognized that a hilltop in southeastern Turkey was not a medieval cemetery. It was covering a monument more than 11,000 years old, built before pottery, before metal, before cities, and before agriculture. The order was wrong. Excavations began in 1995, and beneath the soil came circular stone enclosures, massive T-shaped limestone pillars, carved animal reliefs, and a ceremonial complex that did not fit the old sequence of civilization. The oldest layers were dated to around 9,600 BCE, placing Göbekli Tepe thousands of years before the monuments most people associate with the ancient world. It was older than Stonehenge by roughly 6,000 years, older than the Egyptian pyramids by more than 7,000 years, older than writing, metallurgy, pottery, and settled farming. The people who built it were hunter-gatherers, according to the older model, which should have limited what they could organize. They had no known cities, no wheel, no written language, no domesticated draft animals, and no fully developed farming system to support a large permanent workforce. And yet they raised stone pillars up to 18 feet tall, some weighing as much as 16 tons. For decades, the story of civilization was usually told in one direction. First came farming. Farming created a food surplus. Food surplus allowed permanent settlements. Permanent settlements created hierarchy. And only after that could humans build temples, monuments, and ceremonial landscapes. Göbekli Tepe reversed the order. The monument came first. That single reversal made the site dangerous to the old story. It did not require machines, giants, or impossible technology. But it did force archaeologists to ask a harder question. What if ritual helped create civilization before farming fully held it together? The carvings made the question deeper. Foxes, snakes, birds, scorpions, wild boars, and abstract symbols covered the pillars. Some of the T-shaped stones appeared to represent stylized human bodies, with arms, hands, belts, and loincloths carved into the limestone. This was not a random pile of stones. It was planned, symbolic, and organized. But the strangest part came later. Around 8,000 BCE, after more than 1,000 years of use, the builders or their descendants deliberately buried Göbekli Tepe. They filled the enclosures with rubble, covered the pillars, sealed the structures, and turned the sacred complex back into a hill. That was not abandonment. It was an act. If a site is forgotten, it decays. If a site is destroyed, its stones are broken or reused. Göbekli Tepe was covered so carefully that it survived for more than 11,000 years in remarkable condition. The people who ended the site also preserved it. Mainstream archaeology offers cautious explanations. The burial may have been a ritual closure, a way to retire a sacred place at the end of its use. It may have reflected changes in climate, belief, population, or social life. These explanations are reasonable, but they do not remove the force of the decision. Someone decided this place should disappear, and because of that decision, it survived. That is the contradiction at the heart of Göbekli Tepe. It did not break history by being impossible. It broke history by being too early. A monument built before the old model said monuments should exist. A sacred landscape raised by people once described as simple foragers. A site buried by the same world that had created it. The question is no longer whether hunter-gatherers were capable of complex symbolic life. Göbekli Tepe has already answered that. The question is how much else existed before the official beginning, and how much of it was lost simply because no one buried it in time. Göbekli Tepe showed that monuments came earlier than expected. The next object suggested something even harder to recover: meaning. Number 7. The Shigir Idol. In 1890, gold miners in a peat bog near the Ural Mountains pulled a carved wooden figure from the mud. It had been cut from a single larch trunk, originally stood about 17 feet tall, and later testing showed it was roughly 12,500 years old. That made it older than Göbekli Tepe, older than agriculture in the Fertile Crescent, older than the first known pottery, more than twice as old as the Great Pyramid of Giza. The object was strange. The age was worse. When the Shigir Idol was carved, the last ice age had only recently ended. Much of Eurasia was still emerging from glacial conditions. The people who made it were Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, and for a long time, that label carried an assumption: small groups, simple tools, limited symbols, and little need for monumental art. The idol pushed against that assumption. Its surface was covered with geometric marks, zigzags, horizontal lines, vertical patterns, and stylized human faces. These were not random scratches. Researchers have argued that the arrangement may represent a symbolic system, a way of storing meaning in carved form. That does not mean it was written in the modern sense. It does not mean anyone can translate it. But it does suggest that the human urge to encode memory, belief, territory, myth, or identity into symbols is far older than the first known writing systems. And that is where the object becomes difficult to dismiss. Writing is often treated as one of the great dividing lines between prehistory and history. In the usual timeline, writing emerges in places like Sumer around 3200 BCE, then appears in other early civilizations through different systems and needs. The Shigir Idol does not erase that timeline, but it places something uncomfortable before it: a monumental wooden object covered in signs that seem to have meant something to the people who carved them. The meaning is gone. The marks remain. That is what makes the Shigir Idol more haunting than many stone monuments. A pyramid can impress without being read. A wall can survive as architecture. But the idol feels like a message. It has faces. It has repeated marks. It has a vertical sequence, almost like a body turned into a record, and no one alive knows what it says. Some researchers have suggested the carvings could relate to myth, territory, cosmology, warnings, ancestral memory, or ritual knowledge. Each theory is possible. None is final. The idol does not give up its language just because modern observers want one. Parts of the original figure were lost during the 20th century, and only early drawings or photographs preserve some of what disappeared. New imaging methods, including infrared and laser scanning, have revealed marks that were not visible to the naked eye. The idol is still being studied more than a century after it was found, but every study faces the same wall. The object survived. The culture did not. That is the real wound in the Shigir Idol. They had a symbolic world. Almost all of it vanished. Their stories did not become books. Their signs did not become alphabet. Their meanings did not pass into a language anyone can still speak. The idol stands as evidence that complexity can exist without leaving the records historians prefer. A people can have myths, symbols, sacred landscapes, and deep memory, yet still leave behind almost nothing that later ages know how to read. So the Shigir Idol is not just an old statue. It is a surviving witness from a world that lost its voice. A message crossed 12,500 years to reach us and arrived without its key. The Shigir Idol is a message without a key. The next discovery is a city without a clear fear. Number 6. The Derinkuyu underground city. In 1963, a man renovating his home in Derinkuyu, Turkey, broke through a basement wall and found an opening behind it. It did not lead to a storage room. It led into the upper level of an underground city, carved into volcanic rock, descending roughly 280 feet below the surface. That was only the beginning. Derinkuyu had 18 levels. It could shelter an estimated 20,000 people, along with livestock, food stores, kitchens, schools, churches, ventilation shafts, wells, and living quarters. This was not a cave. It was a planned subterranean world. This was not hiding. This was long-term survival. Small raids do not require an 18-story city under the ground. Short-term hiding does not require schools, wineries, stables, stone ovens, and months of self-sufficient infrastructure. Whoever built the deepest parts of Derinkuyu was not preparing for one night of danger. They were preparing for a world where the surface could no longer be trusted. The defensive features make that clear. Each level could be sealed off by massive rolling stone doors, some weighing more than 1,000 pounds. The passages were narrow enough to force attackers to move single file. Some corridors included sudden drops, false routes, and choke points where defenders could control movement from below. Everything about the design suggests fear, not panic, planning. Every major feature pointed to long-term survival below the surface. But the question is, wait for what? Mainstream history offers several reasonable explanations. Derinkuyu was used by different populations over time. Phrygians may have expanded parts of the system. Early Christians later used underground spaces to hide from persecution. Byzantine communities used them during raids and periods of conflict. Those explanations describe real chapters in the city's later life. But they may not explain the beginning. The oldest core is harder to date. The volcanic tuff of Cappadocia is soft when freshly cut and hardens with exposure, which makes construction possible but dating difficult. Later groups could have reused and expanded older chambers, leaving the original builders hidden behind centuries of occupation. And Derinkuyu was not alone. It was connected by long tunnels to other underground settlements, including Kaymakli. The broader Cappadocia region contains hundreds of subterranean complexes of different sizes. Some were small shelters. Others were large enough to suggest organized, long-term planning across an entire landscape. That scale changes the question. If this were only about occasional military raids, why build so deeply? Why create a network capable of holding entire communities underground? Why remove huge quantities of stone without leaving obvious surface piles large enough to explain the work? The missing stone is one of the quieter problems. Excavating underground cities would have produced enormous amounts of material. Some could have been reused, scattered, or eroded away over time. But the scale still leaves a practical question. Where did all of it go? Derinkuyu does not need to be impossible to be disturbing. Its mystery is more human than technological. It asks what kind of fear can organize people underground at this scale. A passing army can burn a village. A raid can force a family into hiding. But Derinkuyu feels built for something longer, something expected, something that made the open air feel unsafe. The mystery is not an apocalypse. It is the scale of preparation. Today, visitors can descend through only part of the system. Many lower levels remain closed for safety, and sections of the underground network are still not fully mapped. Tourists walk through narrow corridors, past stone doors and dark chambers, seeing only a fraction of what once existed below Cappadocia. The city has been rediscovered, but its original fear has not. Somewhere beneath Derinkuyu, behind sealed passages and unmapped chambers, the real answer may not be who lived there. The harder question is what made so many people decide that survival belonged underground. Derinkuyu asks what drove people underground. The next case asks whether the Earth itself can create shapes that look too organized to be natural. Number 5. The Baigong Pipes. In 2002, Chinese researchers investigated a remote site near Mount Baigong in Qinghai Province, northwestern China. Reports described cave openings in the mountain and strange pipe-like structures embedded in the rock, some extending into the surrounding terrain and toward a nearby saltwater lake. The site was not near an ancient industrial center. It was not in a region known for deep prehistoric metallurgy. Yet hundreds of rust-colored tube-like formations were reported in and around the caves, ranging from several inches wide to so small they were barely visible. But geology did not make the story simple. The formations looked organized. Some appeared to run horizontally through sedimentary layers. Others seemed to descend toward the lake. Their material included iron oxide, silicon dioxide, calcium oxide, and a small portion that early reports described as unidentified. If the pipes were manufactured, the timeline would be impossible. The surrounding rock has been described as extremely ancient, far older than any human metalworking tradition. No accepted version of human history allows people to smelt iron, shape hollow tubes, and place them inside geological formations from deep prehistory. But the responsible version of this story has to begin with the natural explanation. Many geologists argue that the Baigong Pipes are not pipes at all. They may be fossilized tree roots or root-like formations created through natural processes. Under the right conditions, organic material buried in iron-rich sediment can be replaced by minerals, leaving behind hollow tubes that resemble manufactured pipes. Some studies reportedly found plant material in parts of the formations, which supports the fossilized root explanation. For many researchers, that closes the case. But it does not close every question. Some formations appear unusually straight. Some seem to show consistent internal structure. Some are described as having uniform wall thickness and alignment that does not feel random to observers at the site. Supporters argue that natural root systems usually branch, curve, and vary, while some Baigong formations appear to run in cleaner lines. That does not prove they were manufactured. It explains why the story survived. Nature can make shapes that look artificial, but rust-colored tubes inside a mountain are harder for the mind to ignore. The location adds to the unease. Qinghai is remote, high, dry, and historically thinly populated compared with the great centers of early metallurgy. There is no known ancient civilization in that area, with the technology required to produce an industrial pipe network in deep prehistory. If the formations are natural, then they are a strange geological event. If they are artificial, then they break the timeline completely. One explanation is ordinary but incomplete. The other is extraordinary but unsupported. That is why the Baigong Pipes remain useful as a mystery, even if the natural explanation is likely. They show how quickly a formation can challenge history when it appears in the wrong place, in the wrong shape, and in the wrong layer of stone. Today, the site is more curiosity than an active scientific battlefield. Maybe they are fossilized roots. Maybe the early reports made them stranger than they were. But the case became famous because of what the formations looked like. A mountain, a cave, rust-colored tubes in ancient stone, and the uneasy feeling that sometimes nature builds shapes so strange that history has to defend itself from geology. Some mysteries survive because nature looks artificial. Others survive because the evidence disappears. Number 4. The Dropa Stones. In 1938, according to the story, a Chinese archaeologist named Chipu Te led an expedition through the Bayan Har Mountains near the border of China and Tibet. Inside a series of caves, his team reportedly found unusual skeletons and hundreds of stone discs with holes in the center and spiral grooves carved across their surfaces. That was the claim, and almost every part of it became difficult to verify. The discs were said to number more than 700. Each was described as a stone circle, roughly 9 inches wide, with a central hole and tiny symbols running along the spiral grooves. According to later versions of the story, the markings were studied for decades by a researcher named Tsum Nui, who allegedly translated them as a record of beings called the Dropa, stranded in the mountains thousands of years ago. If true, the story would be one of the strangest archaeological discoveries ever made. But the evidence began to collapse almost immediately. There is no solid academic record of a Chinese archaeologist named Chipu Te from that period. The institution where Tsum Nui supposedly worked is difficult to verify. His name does not fit cleanly into known Chinese naming patterns. The original research paper has never been found. Many photographs later used to support the story appear to show ordinary bai discs, a known type of ancient Chinese artifact, not mysterious spiral records. For many researchers, that should end the case. A story with missing scholars, missing papers, and questionable photographs has all the signs of a modern legend. That is the responsible starting point. But the Dropa Stones are interesting because the mystery does not survive as an artifact. It survives as a pattern of absence. The story became harder to kill in 1974 when Austrian engineer Ernst Wegerer reportedly visited the Bampo Museum in Xi'an and photographed 2 stone discs that he believed matched the Dropa descriptions. The objects in his photographs appeared to have central holes and markings that looked superficially similar to the legend. Then, according to the account, the discs disappeared. When Wegerer later tried to follow up, museum staff allegedly denied that the objects had ever been displayed. The director, who had been in charge during his visit, was no longer there. No clean museum record emerged to settle the question. That did not prove the Dropa Stones were real. It made the story harder to close. The strongest case against the Dropa narrative is simple. No primary evidence has survived in a reliable form. No confirmed excavation record. No verified translation. No museum catalog that clearly identifies the discs as described. No academic chain of custody that can carry the story from discovery to study to preservation. Without that chain, history has no object to examine. But if the entire narrative is false, then it is a remarkably durable falsehood. It crossed languages, publications, decades, museums, photographs, and fringe archaeological circles, while hovering close enough to real Chinese artifacts to feel possible. That is the real lesson of the Dropa Stones. Not that they prove a lost civilization, they do not. Not that they prove a forbidden discovery was suppressed, they do not. The evidence is too broken for that. The lesson is how easily the boundary between artifact and story can collapse. A real disc can be misidentified. A vague photograph can become proof. A missing catalog can become suppression. A mistranslated name can become a vanished scholar. And once a story enters that fog, every missing piece starts to do double work. To skeptics, the missing evidence proves the story was false. To believers, missing evidence proves the story was hidden. That is why the Dropa Stones are so difficult to bury. There is no final object at the center anymore, only a disputed memory of an object, repeated often enough that the repetition itself became part of the mystery. The hard evidence is weak, but the myth is powerful. Something is reported, something is photographed, something disappears. Then the absence becomes louder than the object ever was. If the Dropa Stones were a hoax, they were a hoax about trust as much as stone. And if some physical object once existed behind the story, then the tragedy is simpler. It cannot be studied now. The stones, real or imagined, survive only as secondhand claims, contested photographs, and a question that has no clean place to land. Maybe that is why the Dropa story still works. It does not ask the viewer to look at an artifact. It asks the viewer to look at a hole where an artifact should be. And holes are sometimes harder to ignore than stone. The Dropa Stones are almost impossible to verify. The next discovery is the opposite. Accepted science that still feels impossible. Number 3, the Gabon Nuclear Reactor. In 1972, French physicist Francis Perrin was analyzing uranium from the Oklo region of Gabon in West Africa when he noticed a tiny difference that should not have been there. Natural uranium normally contains uranium-235 at a consistent ratio of about 0.720%. The Oklo sample showed about 0.717%. The difference was only 0.00%, but it changed nuclear science. Uranium-235 is the isotope that can sustain nuclear fission. When its ratio is lower than expected, it means some of it has been consumed. In a modern context, that usually points to a reactor, a weapon, or some process capable of splitting atoms and releasing energy. The question was simple. How had natural uranium in Gabon lost part of its uranium-235? The answer was stranger than anyone expected. Investigation showed that the Oklo deposit had once contained natural nuclear reactors. Not one simple reaction, but multiple zones where fission had occurred underground. These reactions began roughly 1.7 billion years ago and continued intermittently for hundreds of thousands of years. This was not an ancient machine. It was nature doing something scientists had thought was almost impossible. The conditions had to be extremely specific. The uranium had to be concentrated enough to sustain a chain reaction. Groundwater had to flow through the deposit and act as a neutron moderator. The surrounding geology had to avoid absorbing too many neutrons. The timing had to be right because uranium-235 decays faster than uranium-238. Around 1.7 billion years ago, the natural concentration of uranium-235 was higher than it is today. Everything had to line up, and at Oklo, it did. That is what makes the Gabon reactor different from many other mysteries. It does not depend on a missing artifact, a disputed photograph, or an unreliable translation. It is accepted science. The reactors existed. The isotope ratios were measured. The fission products were studied. The impossible became real because the evidence forced the model to change. But the unsettling part is that Oklo appears to be unique. It is the only known example of natural nuclear fission of this kind on Earth. Other uranium deposits do not show the same pattern. No other site has produced the same combination of geology, water, timing, and preserved nuclear evidence. That raises a different kind of question. Was Oklo a 1 in a billion accident, or was it simply the only example we have recognized? The reactor also solved a problem that modern engineers still struggle with. Its fission products remained trapped in the surrounding rock for roughly 1.7 billion years. In other words, a natural geological system has contained nuclear waste longer than the entire history of complex life on Earth. That fact matters today. Scientists have studied Oklo because it offers a real-world example of long-term radioactive waste containment. It shows how certain minerals and geological structures can hold dangerous materials in place across unimaginable spans of time. But it also creates a deeper discomfort. Before 1972, natural nuclear reactors were considered theoretical at best and impossible by many. Then a tiny isotope anomaly revealed that one had been operating beneath ancient Gabon for hundreds of thousands of years. A difference too small for most people to notice rewrote an entire assumption. That is the real power of Oklo. It does not say that an ancient civilization built a reactor. It says something more humbling. Earth itself has produced events so rare and precise that human science may only recognize them by accident. The discovery depended on a small numerical discrepancy. If no one had measured that uranium carefully, the reactor would still be hidden inside ordinary-looking rock. It would not glow. It would not announce itself. It would not look like a monument or a machine. It would simply remain part of the ground. And that is the unsettling implication. How many events in the deep past left traces too small to notice? How many strange processes occurred once under perfect conditions and then vanished into geology? How many pieces of Earth's history look ordinary only because no one has asked the right question yet? The Gabon Reactor does not break history in the same way as a disputed artifact. It breaks something else: human confidence. It reminds us that the past is not limited to what people built, carved, buried, or forgot. Sometimes the planet itself creates mysteries and then hides them so well that only a fraction of a percent can bring them back. For 1.7 billion years, Oklo waited in stone, not as a legend, not as a rumor, as a reaction that had already happened, long before anyone existed to be astonished by it. Oklo changed science because the evidence was measurable. The next site shows what happens when evidence and belief become almost impossible to separate. Number 2, the Bosnian Pyramid Complex. In 2005, Bosnian-American researcher Samir Osmanagic visited a hill near the town of Visoko in central Bosnia and claimed it was not a natural formation. He argued that Visočica was an artificial pyramid, possibly larger than the Great Pyramid of Giza and part of a wider complex connected by underground tunnels. That claim exploded almost immediately. The hill rises about 720 feet above the valley floor. Osmanagic's team argued that its sides aligned with the cardinal directions, that its triangular faces were too regular to be accidental, and that surface layers contained shaped stone blocks joined with a binding material they described as ancient concrete. If true, the claim would rewrite European prehistory. But mainstream archaeology rejected it hard. In 2006, the European Association of Archaeologists publicly condemned the Bosnian pyramid claims as a hoax and warned that the project could damage genuine archaeological heritage in the region. Independent geologists identified Visočica as a natural flatiron formation, created by erosion acting on tilted sedimentary rock. The supposed stone blocks were explained as natural breccia. The binding material was interpreted as mineralized sediment. The pyramid shape was dismissed as a pattern recognition. That is the responsible starting point. A hill can look artificial without being artificial. Nature can create geometry that feels designed, but the hill is not the part that keeps the story alive. The tunnels are. Beneath the Visoko Valley is the Raven Tunnel Complex, a system of passages excavated and promoted by the Bosnian Pyramid Project since 2006. Unlike the surface pyramid claim, the tunnels are physically present. People can enter them. Passages have been cleared. Stone blocks, side chambers, and markings have been reported inside. That does not prove the pyramid claim. It means the site is not just a hill with a story. The problem is that the tunnels are trapped inside the reputation of the pyramid claim. To critics, the whole site is contaminated. To believers, that dismissal looks like fear. Once a site is labeled a hoax, everything attached to it becomes easier to ignore. Some caution is necessary. Archaeology has to protect itself from false claims, bad dating, commercial pressure, and national myth-making. But total dismissal creates another danger. Real questions, if they exist, may be left inside a contaminated story. The reported anomalies around Visoko include alignments, underground passages, large stone blocks, and disputed markings. Supporters have proposed very old dates for parts of the tunnel system, while critics argue that the evidence does not meet the standards needed for such claims. The public is often left with only two versions: miracle or fraud. Reality may be less dramatic and more useful. Maybe Visocika is natural, as most geologists argue. Maybe the pyramid claim is wrong. But even if the hill is not a pyramid, the tunnels still raise questions about use, modification, age, and local history. They deserve careful study without requiring the most extreme claims to be true. Evidence never enters the world alone. It comes through people, money, reputation, tourism, politics, and belief. If the wrong claim attaches itself to a site, even real questions become harder to ask. The Bosnian Pyramid Complex may not be the megastructure its supporters imagine, but it shows what happens when archaeology becomes a battlefield. One side sees suppression, the other sees pseudoscience, and the tunnels remain caught between them. Whatever truth the site contains, it is not being hidden only by stone. It is being hidden by the noise around it. The next site has the opposite problem. No theory made it famous. The caves were simply there. Number 1, the Longyou Caves. In 1992, a villager named Wu Anai drained a pond near Xi'an in Zhejiang Province, eastern China. Local people had believed the ponds in the area were bottomless. Wu wanted to prove they were not. When the water dropped, an opening appeared. It led into a massive artificial cavern carved directly into solid siltstone. Then more openings were found. Eventually, at least 24 large underground chambers were identified in the area. Some of the caverns measured thousands of square feet. Ceilings rose up to about 100 feet. Walls and pillars had been carved with repeated parallel tool marks, running across the stone in a consistent diagonal pattern. The mystery was not the caves. It was the silence around them. The Longyou Caves were not natural. They were not small shelters. They were not rough cavities expanded by villagers over time. They were vast, planned, engineered underground spaces, and no historical record clearly explains who built them, why they built them, or where the removed stone went. The scale is enormous. Engineers have estimated that roughly 1 million cubic meters of rock may have been removed to create the chambers. That amount of excavation would have required a large organized workforce working for years, possibly decades, using tools and planning that should have left some kind of trace. But the trace is missing. No spoil heaps have been clearly identified around the site. No surviving records describe the project. No local memory preserved the builders. Even the villagers living above the caves believed the ponds were simply deep bodies of water. That absence is what makes Longyou so powerful. Ancient China kept records. Not perfect records, but extensive ones. Major canals, walls, roads, palaces, tombs, reservoirs, and state projects were often recorded in bureaucratic detail. Officials, labor, materials, costs, and dates could enter written memory. But the Longyou Caves, if built during a historical dynasty, should have been one of the largest engineering works of its region. And yet they appear nowhere in the known record. No emperor claimed them. No dynasty explained them. No official inscription identified their purpose. The tool marks add another layer. The interior surfaces are covered with parallel grooves, about a centimeter wide, running in consistent patterns across walls, ceilings, and pillars. The marks are not confined to a single chamber. They appear across multiple caves, suggesting a shared method, a repeated rule, and a coordinated plan. What tools created those marks? Were they functional, decorative, symbolic, or simply the byproduct of excavation? Why maintain the same pattern across so much surface area? Why carve underground chambers with such care if no one intended to leave a visible record of them? The structural pillars also show planning. The builders removed enormous volumes of rock without collapsing the chambers, leaving behind a design language still visible today. But the purpose is still unclear. Some theories call the caves quarries. Others suggest storage, military use, ritual space, elite refuge, or imperial construction. But every explanation leaves something unresolved. If they were quarries, why carve the interiors so carefully? If they were storage spaces, why hide them underwater? If they were official works, why did no record claim them? The age is also uncertain. Because little organic material has been found inside the chambers, direct radiocarbon dating is difficult. Many estimates place construction around the Qin or Han period, roughly over 2,000 years ago. But these estimates rely on indirect clues rather than a direct construction record. That uncertainty matters. The caves may not require a lost civilization or impossible technology, but they still represent a major historical absence, a vast underground project with no clear builder and no confirmed purpose. That is why Longyou belongs at number 1. It does not depend on a disputed photograph. It does not depend on a missing translation. It does not require anyone to believe humans saw dinosaurs or made figurines 2 million years ago. The caves are there. The chambers exist. The tool marks are visible. The missing stone is real. The silence around the project is the mystery. Longyou is disturbing because an enormous amount of labor was performed without explanation. Thousands of hands may have cut those walls. Workers may have spent years underground, removing stone, shaping pillars, following a plan whose meaning has vanished. Yet the human story behind that labor is gone. Only the geometry remains. In 1992, water drained away and revealed a space that had been waiting in darkness for centuries. The villagers who lived above it did not know what was below them. The records that should have explained it did not speak. The walls, carved with the same repeated marks, became the only surviving testimony, and they do not translate themselves. The Longyou Caves survived. The purpose did not. And somewhere in those silent chambers, behind walls marked by tools no one has fully explained, the past still holds its shape without giving back its name. If you want to keep exploring the parts of history that still do not fit, click the video on screen now and subscribe for more hidden history documentaries.